The train exhaled a final, shuddering sigh of steam and was gone. One moment the platform had been a chaotic blur of noise and bodies. The next, it was just Leanne and the profound, bone-deep silence of a world she did not know. The cold was a living thing, crawling up from the frost-rimmed planks of the platform, seeping through the thin soles of her shoes and the worn fabric of the gray prairie dress she'd been given. It was a cold that felt personal, malevolent. She clutched the small, lumpy bundle tied with twine, the entirety of her worldly possessions. Everything lost. Her home, her language, her name as she knew it. Lost. Gone. The man, Mr. Finch, who had smiled so smoothly and promised a new life, a respectable husband, had simply vanished into the crowd. He'd told her to wait, his English a slick, impenetrable wall of sound. Wait. She waited. The sun, a pale, watery disk in the winter sky, began its descent, bleeding pale orange and violet across the vast, empty plains. The station house windows were dark. The last of the travelers had departed on horseback, their hoofbeats fading into the immense quiet. She was a statue carved from fear, the only motion the violent, uncontrollable shiver that racked her frame. Survival was not a thought. It was a desperate animal instinct. She took a mental inventory. One bundle containing a change of undergarments, a comb, and a small, cracked porcelain teacup from her mother. One piece of paper in her pocket, bearing the name of the man who had left her here to die. No money, no words to ask for help. The cold was getting worse, its teeth sinking deeper. She pressed a hand to her stomach, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with being utterly, terrifyingly alone. This was it then. The grand promise reduced to a frozen plank of wood in a town with no name, under a sky that didn't care. The station master found her at dusk, a hulking silhouette against the deepening indigo of the sky. He carried a lantern that threw long, dancing shadows, making the world feel even more unstable. He spoke in a low rumble, the words harsh and foreign, and gestured with a thick, calloused hand toward the empty station. She shook her head, shrinking back. Fear was its own language, and he seemed to understand it. He grunted, a sound of frustration, not cruelty, and retreated into his office, leaving the door cracked. A sliver of warmth and light spilled onto the platform, an invitation she was too afraid to accept. Sometime later, the crunch of boots on the hard-packed earth announced new arrivals. A man, tall and broad in a heavy sheepskin coat, moved with a weary economy of motion. He was followed by an older woman, his mother from the look of her face a road map of worry and resilience, a thick wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. They were there for a crate of goods, and the cowboy, Owen, spoke in clipped tones to the station master. His gaze swept over Leanne once, a brief, dismissive assessment of a problem that was not his. But the woman, Martha, stopped. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, lingered on Leanne's shivering form. She saw the thin dress, the chapped lips, the stark terror in her eyes. "Owen," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the cold air. "Look at her." He glanced again, his expression unchanged. "Ma, it's not our business. We got feed to haul before the snow sets in for good." "It becomes our business when a person is left to freeze to death on our doorstep," she retorted, her gaze never leaving Leanne. She took a hesitant step forward. Leanne flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every stranger was a threat. Every outstretched hand could hide a fist. Martha paused, her expression softening with a profound, maternal sorrow. She saw not a foreigner, not a burden, but a girl, lost and alone, on the ragged edge of despair. Martha moved slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a frightened foal. She held her hands out, palms open, showing she meant no harm. "It's all right, child," she murmured, the words a gentle, incomprehensible hum. The tone, however, was universal. It spoke of comfort, of safety. Leon's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. Martha was close enough now that Leon could see the fine lines etched around her eyes, the genuine concern that warmed them from within. Owen stood back, his arms crossed, a statue of stoic disapproval. "Ma, we don't know her story. She could be trouble." "She's in trouble," Martha corrected him gently, her focus entirely on the trembling girl before her. "That's the only story that matters right now." She reached out and lightly touched Leon's arm. The fabric of her dress was flimsy, offering no protection. Beneath it, her skin was like ice. The simple human contact was a shock to Leanne's system, a jolt of warmth that threatened to shatter her fragile composure. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed began to well, hot and stinging. Desperate to make them understand, she fumbled in her pocket and produced the crumpled paper. She held it out to Owen, her hand shaking so badly the paper rattled. He took it reluctantly. His eyes scanned the elegant looping script. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "Alistair Finch," he read aloud, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Leanne, then at his mother. Finch. Knew he was a snake. This meant something. The name was a key, unlocking a piece of the puzzle. It confirmed what Leanne already knew in her bones. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This was abandonment. Martha's expression hardened. "That man is poison. He brought her here and left her?" Owen nodded grimly. "Looks that way." He handed the paper back, but Leanne didn't take it. She just stared at him, her eyes pleading. The decision hung in the frigid air between them. Taking her in was a risk, a burden on their already lean existence, but leaving her was a death sentence. Martha made the choice for them. She wrapped an arm around Leon's shoulders, pulling her into the shelter of her own body. "We're taking her home." The journey to the homestead was a blur of motion and biting wind. Owen had settled the crate of supplies and insisted Martha ride his horse, while he walked alongside, leading the animal. He had lifted Leon into the saddle behind his mother with a grudging efficiency, his touch impersonal but not rough. She clung to Martha's waist, burying her face in the thick wool of her shawl, which smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. It was the first scent of home she'd encountered in months. The landscape was brutal and beautiful, a vast expanse of snow-dusted plains and distant dark hills under a sky filled with cold, sharp stars. The silence was immense, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the horse and the creak of leather. Owen said nothing, a silent, formidable figure leading them into the wilderness. The homestead wasn't much. A small, sturdy-looking house and a barn, lights glowing warmly in the windows like a promise. Inside, a fire was banked in the hearth, and the single main room was spare but immaculately clean. It was a house built for survival, not comfort. Yet the warmth that enveloped her was the most luxurious thing she had ever felt. Martha settled her in a chair by the fire, wrapping a thick quilt around her shoulders before ladling a steaming bowl of stew into her hands. Leon ate ravenously, the hot, savory liquid chasing the deep chill from her bones. She didn't realize she was crying until Martha gently wiped a tear from her cheek with a calloused thumb. Owen remained distant, moving about the room, stoking the fire, checking the locks. He watched her from the corners of his eyes, his expression unreadable. He was a man locked in his own grief, a fact that hung in the air of the house as palpably as the scent of pine. In the days that followed, Leon found her place in the quiet rhythm of their lives. She rose before dawn, her body instinctively seeking purpose. She learned by watching, her hands quick and clever. She mended Owen's torn shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned to pluck a chicken, her movements precise, wasting nothing. She helped Martha knead bread, her small hands mimicking the older woman's practiced motions. She did not speak, but her actions spoke for her. They said, "I am not a burden. I will earn my keep. I am useful." And slowly, the house began to change. Her quiet presence filled a space they hadn't known was empty. One evening, a fierce blizzard descended, trapping them inside. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and piling snow against the door. Martha had developed a deep, rattling cough, and by nightfall a fever had taken hold. She lay in her bed, her breathing shallow, her face flushed. Owen paced the floor, his helplessness a palpable storm in the small room. He was a man who could face down a blizzard or a predator, but he was powerless against the sickness that gripped his mother. Leanne took charge. She remembered the remedies of her grandmother, the wisdom passed down through generations. She found a small tin of dried herbs in her bundle and brewed a pungent, steaming tea, forcing the hot liquid past Martha's lips. She soaked rags in cool water and laid them on the old woman's forehead, her touch gentle and sure. For 2 days and 2 nights she did not leave Martha's side. She dozed in the chair beside the bed, waking at the slightest sound. Owen watched her, his initial suspicion melting into a grudging respect, and then something more. He saw the fierce, protective care in her eyes, the exhaustion she refused to give in to. He started leaving a mug of hot, sweetened coffee for her on the mantelpiece, a silent offering of fuel and gratitude. On the 3rd morning the fever broke. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, blinding white. Martha opened her eyes, her gaze clear for the first time in days. She saw Leon asleep in the chair, her head slumped at an awkward angle, her face pale with fatigue. A wave of overwhelming affection washed over the old woman. She reached out a frail hand and rested it on Leon's hair. Leon stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Seeing Martha awake and lucid, a tremulous smile touched her lips. Martha's own eyes filled with tears. She tightened her grip gently. "My good daughter," she whispered, her voice raspy but full of a profound, unshakable conviction. The word daughter landed in the quiet room with the force of a revelation. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip of a fevered tongue. It was a declaration. It was an adoption of the heart. From the doorway, where he had been standing watch, Owen heard it. He saw the way Leanne's entire being seemed to settle, as if she had finally found her anchor in a storm-tossed sea. He looked at this stranger who had saved his mother, and for the first time he saw family. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh winter slowly relinquished its grip, the snow receding to reveal the stubborn green of new life. Leanne thawed with the landscape. A quiet confidence began to bloom in her. Martha's gentle tutelage, combined with Owen's slow, steady patience, had given her a small arsenal of English words. They were simple, practical words for a simple, practical life. Water, bread, fire, horse, morning, tired. But they were hers. She wore a dress of dark blue wool that Martha had painstakingly altered, the fabric warm and sturdy against her skin. Her cheeks had a healthy color, and the haunted, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a watchful calm. When they rode into town for supplies, she no longer flinched at every stranger's gaze. She sat tall on the horse behind Owen, her hands resting lightly on his waist, a gesture of easy familiarity that had developed over time. The town of Redemption was a single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, but to Leon, it felt like a metropolis. She held Martha's basket, her eyes taking in the sights and sounds with a quiet curiosity. It was then that a fine black carriage, pulled by 2 perfectly matched gray horses, rolled to a stop in front of the mercantile. The door opened, and Mr. Alistair Finch stepped out. He was exactly as she remembered, impeccably dressed, his face handsome in a way that seemed polished and artificial. His smile was bright, but it never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He scanned the street, and his gaze landed on Leanne. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, quickly masked by a look of charming relief. He strode toward them, his expensive boots kicking up dust. "There you are," he said, his voice a smooth, proprietary balm that made Leanne's skin crawl. "My dear girl, I was unavoidably delayed. Business in the capital. I've been looking for you everywhere." He completely ignored Owen and Martha, as if they were nothing more than fence posts. His eyes raked over her, noting the healthier appearance, the better clothes. "I see you've made yourself useful, but the time for charity is over." He reached for her arm, his smile a predatory baring of teeth. "Come along, we have a wedding to plan." Owen moved before Leanne could even flinch. He didn't say a word. He simply shifted his body, placing himself squarely between Finch and Leanne. It was a simple, solid statement. "You will not touch her." Finch's smile tightened. "Step aside, farmer. This is a private matter." "She's with us," Owen said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The entire street had gone quiet. People stopped in their tracks. Conversations died. Everyone was watching. Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "With you? Don't be absurd. She is my property. I have the contract, signed and sealed. I paid her passage from a land of filth and starvation to give her a new life. She owes me." He brandished a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "This document states she is my intended, bound to me, legally." The word property struck Leon like a physical blow. It stripped away the fragile sense of self she had so carefully rebuilt. She was not a person. She was a thing to be owned. The old, familiar ice of fear began to creep back into her veins. But then she looked past Owen's broad back and saw Martha. The old woman's face was a mask of cold fury. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, unwavering resolve. That look was a shield. It was a sword. It gave Leanne the strength to find her own voice. "No," she said. The word was quiet, barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the street it rang out like a gunshot. Finch's head snapped toward her, his expression of charming condescension curdling into genuine anger. "What did you say?" Leanne took a breath, drawing strength from the two people who stood like mountains at her side. She met his gaze directly. "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, laced with the steel she hadn't known she possessed. "I am not your property." A murmur went through the small crowd of onlookers. Finch's face flushed a dark, ugly red. "You ungrateful little shrew! After all I've done for you? You'll come with me now, or I'll have Sheriff Bates lock you in a cell until you learn some manners." He lunged for her again, but this time he was met not just by Owen, but by a town that had made its decision. Sheriff Bates, a weary man who preferred peace to conflict, stepped forward reluctantly. "Now, Mr. Finch, let's just calm down." Finch rounded on him, shoving the papers in his face. "This is a legal contract, Sheriff. She is a runaway. I demand you enforce my rights." The sheriff looked from the furious, wealthy man to the quiet, defiant family. He was a man caught between the letter of the law and the heart of his community. Before he could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. It was Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, a woman whose opinion carried weight. She stepped off the boardwalk, wiping her hands on her apron. "That girl has been living with Martha Hale since the first snows, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We've all seen her. She's a good, hard-working girl, not a runaway." "She was left at the train station," another man added, the blacksmith. "My boy saw her there, alone, for hours. Looked half frozen." One by one, others spoke up. The seamstress who had sold Martha the wool for Leanne's dress. The farmer who had seen Owen teaching her to scatter chicken feed. They were simple observations, pieces of a life lived openly, honestly. They formed a wall of testimony, a collective truth that stood in stark opposition to Finch's legal document. They had watched Leanne be woven into the fabric of their community, into the heart of the Hale family. They were bearing witness. Finch was stunned into silence. He had expected to walk into town, reclaim his possession with a show of wealth and authority, and be on his way. He had not counted on the fierce loyalty of this small, rugged community. He had not counted on the fact that they had seen Leon not as an object, but as a person. And he certainly had not counted on the formidable, unyielding love of a woman who had already named her daughter. The power dynamic on the dusty street had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer one man's legal claim against one voiceless woman. It was his word against the word of an entire town. Given the public nature of the dispute and the legal document Finch possessed, Sheriff Bates had no choice but to arrange a formal hearing. The circuit judge, a formidable man named Morrison with eyes that missed nothing, was due in redemption the following week. The hearing was held in the town hall, a large, drafty room filled with wooden benches. The entire town seemed to be there, packing the space, their presence a silent, solid show of support for the Hales. Finch sat at a table with a slick-looking lawyer he'd brought in from the capital. They were a portrait of urban sophistication and entitlement. On the other side sat Leon, with Martha on one side and Owen on the other. They looked like what they were, people of the land, their strength grounded and unadorned. Finch's lawyer went first. He presented the contract, speaking in lofty terms about Christian charity and civilizing missions. He painted Leon as a cunning opportunist who had preyed on the sympathies of a grieving family, abandoning her benefactor at the first opportunity. He attacked her credibility, sneering as he pointed out her convenient inability to speak the language when it suited her. When Martha was called to speak, she simply told the truth. She spoke of finding a terrified girl freezing on the platform, of the name on the paper, of the illness, of the quiet, diligent way Leanne had breathed life back into their silent home. "She is my daughter," she finished, her voice ringing with emotion. "Not by blood, by choice, and no piece of paper written by a man with a black heart can change that." Owen spoke next. His testimony was shorter, his words carefully chosen. He spoke of Finch's reputation, of the impossible situation Leanne had been left in. He described her work, her kindness, her courage. Then Judge Morrison looked at Leanne. "Miss," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I would like to hear from you." A hush fell over the room. Leanne stood, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She took a deep breath, looked directly at the judge, and began to speak in her clear, slightly accented English. She told them everything. The promises whispered in her village, the crowded boat, the long train ride. She spoke of Mr. Finch's cool indifference and the final casual instruction to wait. And she spoke of the cold, the terrible, endless cold of that platform and the warmth of Martha's hand. Leon did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She simply laid out the facts of her abandonment, her fear, and her rescue. Her plain-spoken truth was more powerful than any of the lawyer's flowery rhetoric. "He did not forget me," she said, her gaze shifting to Alistair Finch for the first time. His face was a mask of contempt. "He left me to die." When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Judge Morrison turned his stern gaze upon Finch. "Mr. Finch, you claim you were delayed on business. What business was so urgent that it required you to leave a woman, a stranger in this country who does not speak the language, alone and unprovided for in the dead of winter?" Finch sputtered, offering a weak story about a telegram and a sudden meeting. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him to silence. "Your contract," Morrison said, picking up the document, "mentions passage and arrangement of marriage. It also implies a duty of care upon arrival. You seem to have failed spectacularly in that duty." He scanned the faces in the crowd, the blacksmith, Mrs. Gable, all the people who had spoken up. "It seems to this court that the contract was broken first by you, Mr. Finch. You did not deliver this woman to a new life. You delivered her to her potential death. By abandoning her, you voided any and all claim you have upon her. She was a free woman from the moment you walked away from that train." He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder. "This hearing is concluded. Miss Leanne is free to remain with whomever she chooses. Mr. Finch, I suggest you and your carriage depart from this town immediately." A collective cheer erupted in the hall. Finch, his face pale with fury and humiliation, stormed out without a backward glance. That evening the world felt new. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the faces of the three people sitting before it. The victory in town felt distant, dreamlike. This, right here, was real. The quiet safety of home. Martha was humming softly, mending a tear in Owen's coat. Owen stared into the flames, his usual stoic silence feeling different tonight, not guarded, but peaceful. He turned to Leon. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "This is your home now, Leon," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "If you'll have it." She looked from his earnest, searching eyes to Martha's loving smile. The journey had been a nightmare, a passage through fire and ice, but it had led her here, to them. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, lighting her from within. It was a smile of relief, of belonging, of a future she could finally dare to imagine. "I am finally home," she whispered.